And it starts to feel a lot like what Madison was describing here in Europe, where the government is afraid to allow its own people to be armed. And what's that old saying? Any government that starts to indicate that they want to take away your weapons is probably a government that intends to do something soon that you would shoot them for.
Yeah.
You know, right now, here in Virginia, the Second Amendment issue is front and center because the new administration under Abigail Spanberger, the current General Assembly, they are working overtime to implement new gun control laws that take away your Second Amendment rights in all but name only. You have the right, but it is so difficult to exercise that right within the boundaries of the laws that they are trying to pass that you essentially don't have it. This idea that Madison had that a combination of state governments and an armed citizenry could resist any overreach by the federal government, even in a hypothetical military conflict.
I never really thought of it that way, that, 45 and 46 were, potential justifications for the South seceding and, leading to a civil war. And I had thought about, of course, like I said, the Declaration of Independence, but yeah, it's again, it's kind of a touchy subject because we do want, the co-hosts on this podcast generally want the states to have the freedom to be independent from the federal government, where it makes sense, where it's constitutionally protected to do so. That is still kind of a sticking point as to what that means in effect. And I don't know if people know this, but there's talks in the modern today, in the last decade or so, of like portions of California seceding from the Union, and portions of Oregon and Colorado, where you have these states that are the blue and the red portions of the states are so distinctly different, either seceding from the United States or seceding from the state itself to create its own state. So there's actually movements out there that are openly, that exist right now, that are talking about that. So it's not a thing that just kind of died with the end of the Civil War. It's, again, we've talked about the Commerce Clause. You can argue has led to federal overreach of what the Constitution intended. We talked about the Chevron doctrine leading to overreach, using these agencies and giving them powers that the Constitution never gave them. So if those kind of things go too far, the states should still need to have some kind of recourse to be able to free itself from that overreach. So just an argument that has not gone away.
So in addition to a lot of people's confusion between the difference between a democracy and a republic, I think there's also not a very firm understanding of the difference between a national and federal form of government. And Madison, in Federalist number 39, tried to explain that. The understanding of the Constitution since Madison's time has definitely changed. Seems like a lot of politicians nowadays, administrations, they look to the Constitution to say, if it doesn't say I can't do it, then I can, which is 180 degrees out of the original intent. You can only do what is specifically enumerated in the Constitution as the federal government. We need to get back to that.
Critics, including states' rights advocates, saw this as overriding the 10th Amendment by letting Congress regulate almost anything with an economic nexus, diminishing reserved state powers over local matters like education, crime, or zoning. It's just interesting how these arguments over time started with the arguments made by Madison, Hamilton, other founding fathers. They were trying to prevent and balance these very complicated situations, because the Commerce Clause was in the Constitution for a reason to make sense. But if you interpret it incorrectly or with a bias or an agenda, it can be twisted and used to undermine or push out of balance what the founders were desperately trying to get into balance.
The Senate effectively became a super House of Representatives. still has unique powers and longer terms, but its members are chosen through the same national principle of popular election. Madison's vision was one house for the people and one house for the states, and the 17th Amendment erased that vision.
It's the first kind of clear articulation of that argument that I've heard during doing the research with this. We've heard talk of trying to maybe go back to Madison's original intent with this by a new amendment or whatever. And I still struggle with that. It's hard to envision. He makes a good point, and his arguments are clear there. And I think that one of the points he just brought up was that it would insulate the Senate from, again, those factions, and it does make them operate from a different perspective and a different level of accountability, and like which version is better. But I'd be supportive of trying to go back to how that was. So anyway, it's a very interesting argument.
I've read the Constitution numerous times. I've flipped through the Federalist Papers in the past, but I learned new things this time going through some of these papers. And like you said, I think as you read, you can read the same book sometimes multiple times, but you're not the same person every time that you read it. You've had experiences since you read it last. You've made observations. Hopefully you've grown wiser as you've grown older. And so the same book can speak to you in different ways based on the experiences that you've had since the last time you read it. That's one of the most powerful things about the Bible, I think. But in some ways, the Constitution and the Federalist Papers are the same way. And so I'm sure I've read a lot of this before, but it didn't hit me the same way as it did this time around, because the world has changed. I've changed. I've learned things. Hopefully, I know I've grown older. Hopefully, I've grown wiser as well. I think it's probably incumbent upon us to let everybody know that we're not attorneys. We're not constitutional scholars. We both spent the majority of our adult life defending the Constitution, though, and I think we both subscribe to the view of George Mifflin Dallas, the 11th Vice President of the United States, who said, "I hold that every American citizen has a right to form an opinion of the Constitution. The Constitution in its words is plain and intelligible and is meant for the homebred, unsophisticated understanding of our fellow citizens." I would put myself in that category, homebred and unsophisticated. I take it, therefore, Dallas said, "it is not a presumption in the private citizen to form an opinion of the Constitution." So that's what we're doing here. It's just two homebred, unsophisticated dudes reading the Constitution, reading the Federalist Papers, and forming an opinion about it. And I hope other people will too. Good day, everybody, and welcome back to Fire for Effect. This is episode 31, part 2 of this discussion that we've been having on Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, where they agree, where they differ, and how both of them really significantly impacted our Constitution, our understanding of the Constitution, its ratification for sure. Both of these gentlemen were contributors to the Federalist Papers, which is kind of a behind-the-scenes look at the reasoning for why the founders structured the Constitution the way they did, their explanation. It's really an excellent companion to the Constitution to help us understand the why behind it and the thought processes. Of course, the Federalist Papers, that was their point. That was their reason for being. Was during the ratification process, explaining to everybody what the Constitution was, the proposed Constitution that the states needed to ratify, what it was, why it was good, why it made sense, and the reasoning behind it all. And so we're recording this now on February 20th. Again, part 2 of Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. Last week, we took a hard look at Alexander Hamilton. This week, we're going to look at James Madison, at the papers that he wrote and where he differs slightly from Alexander Hamilton, and in a couple of places where they agree. And then next week, we'll really focus on the comparison of the two and how we can look around even today at the way our government is structured and operates, and we can see echoes from both of these gentlemen in today's government and how we operate. So I'm here today with Jim McBride. Good to see you, Jim. How you doing?
Good, Marcus. I'm doing well. Thanks. Yeah, looking forward to this one. It's going to be interesting to see if you listen to the last episode, episode 30. Was it episode? We're in 31 now. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay. So episode 30 the last time, talking about Hamilton. We both, I think, kind of surprised ourselves as we were researching Hamilton and some of the things that he believed. And I kind of knew going into it, this is why we picked this topic, is we knew that there were some differences between Hamilton and Madison, distinct enough to where even though they were the overwhelming preponderance of the writers of the Federalist Papers and agreed on overwhelming number of principles that led to the American founding, the one thing that they disagreed on, and it's highlighted in about 5 or so different Federalist Papers, well, 5 that Madison wrote and a few other ones that Hamilton wrote that we addressed last week on the importance of a strong executive. And we on this podcast generally kind of believe in limited government, and we definitely believe in states' rights and the power, the freedom of the individual and the rights of the individual, and just kind of more of a small government kind of mindset. However, Hamilton made some really great arguments as to why there needs to be a strong executive, and I don't disagree with a lot of those arguments. So it'd be nice today to kind of contrast that with some of the counter arguments that Madison made as to why there should not be a strong executive. And he didn't always put it in those terms, but we'll pull that thread a little bit today and reading some of these Federalist Papers. But again, just want to stress that they agreed overwhelmingly on so many principles, which is why they're still have an enduring influence in America today. And to your last point, we'll be able to next week, and this episode as well, but also next week in particular, kind of once we could do a strong comparison, be able to kind of translate that to today, like whose perspective on the strong executive has borne out over time as being right or wrong, or and how are things being done today, and can we learn from the lessons that they tried to convey to us through the Federalist Papers and other writings. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, I've read the Constitution numerous times. I've flipped through the Federalist Papers in the past, but I learned new things this time going through some of these papers. And like you said, I think as you read, you can read the same book sometimes multiple times, but you're not the same person every time that you read it. You've had experiences since you read it last. You've made observations. Hopefully you've grown wiser as you've grown older. And so the same book can speak to you in different ways based on the experiences that you've had since the last time you read it. That's one of the most powerful things about the Bible, I think. But in some ways, the Constitution and the Federalist Papers are the same way. And so I'm sure I've read a lot of this before, but it didn't hit me the same way as it did this time around, because the world has changed. I've changed. I've learned things. Hopefully I know I've grown older. Hopefully I've grown wiser as well. But, as we were studying Hamilton last week, some of the things that he said about the executive, if you hadn't lived through the last 10 years of American history, it wouldn't mean the same thing to you as it does now when you read it. And likewise, Madison, um, what I read about him this week as we were studying for this episode, a lot of the things that he wrote made more sense to me now than it did the last time that I read it. Uh, some of it affects old history, and I hope we get around to it today. But the Civil War, one of the most significant events in American history, we look back on it now, and it seems so cut and dry. But to the people at the time, it was a constitutional struggle for a lot of them. And if you've never read what Madison wrote, you might not understand why it was so difficult of a concept for the folks during the Civil War who were struggling with what they viewed as a constitutional issue. Why did they view it as a constitutional issue? A lot of it had to do with some of the things Madison wrote about the division of powers and states' right in particular, and factions. As we'll show when we talk about this, I think it was twisted. A lot of his words were twisted in order to support an argument in favor of secession. But a fuller understanding of the Federalist Papers and specifically Madison's contributions to it starts to make that conflict make a little bit more sense as to why people could have had kind of a reasonable view of the Constitution that would lead them to different conclusions that ultimately led to that conflict. So anyways, very, very fascinating. And James Madison was obviously a pivotal figure in the creation and the ratification of the Constitution. It earned him the title of Father of the Constitution. He was the key author of one of the key authors of the Federalist Papers, which, if you haven't read it and you're not familiar, is a series of 85 essays that were written to persuade the states, particularly New York, to ratify the newly proposed U.S. Constitution. Along with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, Madison wrote under the pseudonym Publius, which we've mentioned on this podcast many times before as well. Hamilton, by far, penned the most of these essays. 51 of the 85 belonged to Hamilton. James Madison contributed 29 articles, and then John Jay coming in at just 5. Last week, we talked a lot about Hamilton and his view of the executive, and we'll start there with James Madison today and his view of the executive as well, and then we'll branch out into some of the other things that he believed. But one point of clarification from last week, if you recall, Hamilton, when he made the argument for a strong executive, he pointed to the fact that the way the states currently were doing business did not reflect that strong executive. And we made a comment that it appeared from his writing that all but New York and New Jersey seemed to have some form of an executive that or didn't have an executive, or it was some form of an executive that didn't really vest power in the hands of one person. And I think I may have misstated something, so I just wanted to clarify it. And the point that we were making came from Federalist number 70, when Alexander Hamilton wrote that New York and New Jersey, if I recollect right, are the only states which have entrusted the executive authority wholly to single men. And when we read that last week, we took that to mean that New York and New Jersey were the only states of the original 13 that had a single executive. And it's a little bit more nuanced than that. 12 of the original 13 states were governed by a single executive, a governor, before the ratification of the Constitution in 1788. However, most of those states failed Hamilton's test of a strong executive because their state constitutions were intentionally hostile toward an executive power, understandably reacting against royal governors that they had just fought a war to get rid of. In many of the states, the governors were required to act with a council. So like Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, these states had, in Hamilton's view, a plural executive power in practice, even if not in name. So they may have had a governor, but that governor was beholden to a council that kind of nullified his ability to act. Hamilton praised specifically, as I just read in Federalist number 70, he specifically pointed out and praised New York and to a lesser extent New Jersey because they came closest to his ideal of having a strong, energetic is the word that he used, executive. And Pennsylvania was the outlier as the most negative example in Hamilton's view of a plural executive power. It didn't have a single executive. It had diffused responsibility, which in Hamilton's view was very inefficient and prone to faction. So Hamilton's argument was that he believed most states functionally resembled Pennsylvania, even if they kept the title governor. So I just wanted to clarify that. It wasn't that none or most of the states didn't have a governor, but in Hamilton's view, at least in practicality, the governor was not really, the buck didn't stop with him. He had a council that he had to answer to in most of these instances. Pennsylvania being the only one that truly didn't have, a single authority. It was a plural executive council. So anyway, wanted to clarify that from last week. But Madison had some interesting things to say about the executive as well. And he wrote a number of, like we said, 29 articles that he contributed to the Federalist Papers. But his view of the executive, by the way, we get our concept of separation of powers largely from Madison. And so he had a different view of the executive than Hamilton did. He wasn't as much in favor of a strong executive as Hamilton was.
Yeah, I think he kind of did a series like from 47 to 51 were more or less directed towards that topic and his argument of a kind of a weaker executive. So just a quick summary. I won't like quote any of them, but just 47. He defends the Constitution's partial blending of powers against accusations of violating strict separation, arguing that Montesquieu's principles allow for checks without consolidation. 48, he warns of the legislature's tendency to absorb powers from other branches, citing historical examples of state governments under the Confederation. Federalist 49, he rejects Thomas Jefferson's idea of frequent constitutional conventions to resolve interbranch disputes. During popular passions could undermine stability. Federalist 50 critiques periodic appeals to the people as ineffective for maintaining balance. And then 51 famously outlines the checks and balances. So probably that one in particular, stating that each department should have, quote, a will of its own, unquote, while being interconnected to prevent dominance.
Yeah, it seemed though that while Madison wasn't in favor of an executive that was as strong as the one Hamilton was advocating for, Madison was more worried about the power in the legislative branch. It seemed his point was that the legislative branch, by virtue of being the largest and also being having the power of the purse and its proximity to the people, made it more dangerous than the other two. And the factions that Hamilton, his point for having a single executive, that it wouldn't be as prone to factions that are bound to pop up in a larger group. And Madison agreed with that about factions, that the human nature is prone to it. So that's what Hamilton was trying to guard against in the executive. And I think Madison saw the danger of that in the legislative branch, and that's why he was as concerned as he was about it, and rightly so. What do you think? Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think that's about right. I agree. And before I forgot to bring this up at the beginning. Sorry to redirect just really quick. We talked about, we're talking about the Madison focusing on the executive and the things that you just mentioned, as well as contrasting that with Hamilton. I did want to point out that it's believed, now again, these Federalist Papers were written, as you said, under the pseudonym Publius. So it took a little bit of historical research to figure out who wrote which paper in particular. in a lot of cases. And it's widely believed that they both co-wrote, Hamilton and Madison co-wrote Federalist Papers numbers 18, 19, and 20. These essays discuss the ancient confederacies as cautionary tales for the U.S., with Madison providing historical notes and research that Hamilton incorporated into the writing. Anyway, so I just want to point that out because they both came from the same perspective, I guess you could say, but just kind of stressed a little bit of if you go too far in either direction, too strong of an executive or too weak of an executive. And it's just really great that they were able to kind of tease that out a little bit and have a different perspective. But sorry for that diversion. But yeah, I agree with your assessment there.
I don't think that's a diversion. I think that's right in line. And that's the brilliance of our Constitution, is that all of these concerns were balanced in really the optimum way. I mean, it is a brilliant arrangement that recognizes human nature, and rather than trying to pretend that somehow morality, and virtue will overcome the pitfalls of any government that is run by human beings, it acknowledged the fallibility of humans, their ambitions, their propensity for corruptness, and rather than treating that as a negative, it turned it into a strength, using it to counterbalance, as Madison wrote, using ambition to counter ambition. And so using flawed human nature as a way to protect the Constitution as opposed to tear it down. But Madison's concern about the legislative branch becoming too powerful and needing to be countered, again, if you think about what they had just come out of, the tyranny that they had just resisted through a war, they were wary of tyranny of any form. And whether that's one tyrant or 435 of them, it's the same thing in their mind. In Federalist number 47, Madison essentially said that. He said that the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one or a few or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced as the very definition of tyranny. And so he didn't want to see any one of the branches with too much power unchecked and unbalanced by the other two. And so, and he realized that this document that they had just written, the Constitution, was just a piece of paper, and it had only the power that the people gave to it, and it had to be more than just words. It had to be the government that it described functionally had to provide these checks and balances. He referred to it as a mere parchment barrier in Federalist number 48. And he said that it can't be denied that power is of an encroaching nature, and that it ought to be effectually restrained from passing the limits assigned to it. And I don't know if that line was directly aimed at Hamilton's view of the executive, but it's certainly tempers the view of an overly energetic executive, I think.
Yeah. He also said in 48, I like this, the legislative department is everywhere extending the sphere of its activity and drawing all power into its impetuous vortex. Again, these guys were just so good with their choice of words and how they wrote, drawing all power into its impetuous vortex. Yeah, and what your quote and the quote I just said stress the need to limit any branch's power which again, all three of them agreed that they were trying to balance and make sure that neither branch of the government would be too powerful. They're trying to ensure there was checks and balances on all three branches, because, as we've both mentioned, they just came from a, a, a monarchical, how do you say that? A monarchy,
Monarchical.
monarchical. Thank you. That was, way out of balance and too much power and at the expense of the people. So those two quotes, they stress the need to limit any branch's power, but Madison notes the executive is carefully limited and restrained within a narrower compass, implying structural limits on executive authority to prevent it from becoming unchecked.
Yeah, I found that statement interesting as well about Congress's um, its vortex, its impetuous vortex, just like a black hole of power. I wonder though, if Madison could see the legislature today, what he would think about that, or if he had watched it over the last 10 years. Because it seems to me that rather than absorbing power into its vortex, it seems to be outsourcing a lot of it through regulatory agencies, and
Mm.
which are unelected, no accountability to the people. The people have zero ability to affect that. And I believe that the vast majority of our laws come through regulatory agencies and not through the body that was elected to pass laws. And maybe it's not completely fair to say that they don't want the power. I think they want all the power, but they don't want any of the accountability or responsibility. That was what Alexander Hamilton was concerned about, the fact that you have a large body of people where it's easy to blame everybody else. And it's difficult to hold anybody accountable because you're not sure, as he wrote in one of his papers, the people are just mystified as to whose hands have foiled their desires.
Excellent point, by the way. That's a really good point. I hadn't thought of that when you said that that Congress has been outsourcing, and I was gonna, in my mind, I thought you were going towards outsourcing to the executive, but then you said regulatory agencies, which is a very good point. I hadn't thought of that recently, because they've kind of done both. I agree with you that Congress has not been held it's again kind of back to human nature. As a body, seems to me that they have taken kind of crafted how they do legislation uh, to the path of least resistance, I guess you could say. So if you can outsource a lot of your authority and responsibility to regulatory agencies, like you said, that have almost no accountability, um, and no checks and balances, then that makes your job as Congress easier. You have less things that you have to deliberate on, less things you have to vote on, and outsource it to the experts. We're not the experts. Let's let the experts make these decisions and make these laws. Frankly, and we talked about outsourcing to the executive. We mentioned last week about how presidents for decades have effectively conducted wars overseas without requiring Congress to declare war. That alone is outsourcing Congress's responsibility. Really quick, I had to look this up when you brought up the regulatory agency thing, because there was a recent Supreme Court decision that is, I think, will lead to getting that back in line, putting the responsibility back on Congress's shoulders, and it was U.S. Supreme Court decision that restricted the authority of regulatory agencies is the Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo, which was decided on June 28, 2024, consolidated with Relentless Incorporated versus Department of Commerce. In a 6-3 ruling written by Chief Justice John Roberts, the court overturned the long-standing Chevron doctrine from the 1984 case Chevron USA Incorporated versus Natural Resources Defense Council. Under the Chevron deference established in 84, courts were required to defer to a federal agency's reasonable interpretation of an ambiguous statute that the agency administers. This gave agencies significant leeway to interpret and implement laws, especially where Congress left gaps or unclear language. So again, that allowed Congress to kind of get lazier and lazier by passing legislation that was almost purposely or just negligently unclear, and left gaps that allowed these agencies to interpret the way they wanted to. The Supreme Court in the Loper-Bright case held that this doctrine is incompatible with the Administrative Procedure Act, which requires courts to exercise independent judgment on questions of law. Courts may no longer automatically defer to an agency's interpretation simply because a statute is ambiguous. I could go on, but that was a very, very fundamental case that I had forgotten about until you just said that the legislative branch has outsourced to regulatory agencies and has for decades. So hopefully we'll start seeing the effects of this case resulting in Congress being more clear and specific about passing regulations that are representative of the people, because they're representatives of the people, instead of outsourcing it to these agencies. So good point.
And I think that's why people are so frustrated, because they feel the administrative burden of the law, but they're not sure who to blame.
Exactly.
And the thing that makes it even more frustrating, and maybe a lot of people probably don't realize, they don't know who to blame because the people who are actually to blame are not people that they can reach, even if they wanted to, because it's not their representative.
Right.
And so this is exactly what Hamilton was talking about when he said that when you have this diffusion of responsibility in a council, which is really what Congress is, it's a 435-member council. He wrote in Federalist 70 that the people remain altogether at a loss to determine by whose influence their interests have been committed to hands so unqualified and so manifestly improper. And so people just can't figure out why things can't get done, why their will, the will of the people, can't be or won't be implemented by the people that they elected to do just that for them. And they have a suspicion that the problem is in Congress, but it's never with their congressman, for the most part, in their view. And in February of 2026, Congress's approval rating was at 26%. Some individual polls have showed that approval ratings have at times dipped into the teens, 15% in October of 2025. However,
wow,
what's the re-election rate of incumbents?
It's got to be,
let me look,
70% or something. I'm just guessing.
Yeah, let's see. What is the re-election rate of congressional incumbents? It's going to be high. Whoa. U.S. House of Representatives, most incumbents who run for re-election win their races. In recent cycles, around 94 to 98% of House incumbents seeking re-election have been successful. For example, in the 2024 general election, about 95% of incumbents nationwide won their re-election bids. So, as a body, as a council, their approval rating is 26% or less, but individually, their approval rating is apparently 95 plus. And so people are frustrated. They know there's a problem, but they don't think it's the person that they have the ability to elect or re-elect. And it's
That's
crazy.
incredible. Yeah.
And the point that you were making about the court case reining this power back in to Congress, there Mike Lee from Utah actually had authored or maybe co-authored a piece of legislation a while back called the Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act, the REINS Act. Are you familiar with this? Have you heard
Nice.
of this?
No.
It's a bill that Senator Mike Lee, Republican from Utah, has long championed to curb the power of federal regulatory agencies and return core lawmaking authority to Congress itself. It would require Congress to vote up or down on any new major federal regulation before that regulation could take effect. Essentially, now Congress is on the dot, having to give a thumbs up or a thumb, which is the way it should be.
Mm-hmm.
The word major is usually defined as having an economic impact of $100 million or more per year. Under the current law, federal agencies can issue binding rules and regulations under broad statutory authority. We all knew that. Often without specific congressional approval, which critics argue amounts to lawmaking by unelected bureaucrats. Critics are right.
Yep.
The REINS Act seeks to reverse that by ensuring major regulatory decisions must pass through the full constitutional legislative process, approval by both chambers, and presentment to the president. So, without knowing any more than that, I'm a huge fan of the REINS Act.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Bringing
It sounds
lawmaking
like
authority back to where it belongs.
Yeah, and I'm guessing he crafted that legislation specifically because of the Supreme Court case, about the Chevron defense, overturning that. And now he's like, okay, it's back in our hands. Now we got to craft legislation to, um, redefine what our role was supposed to be all along, frankly. So that's awesome. That's a positive example of our different branches of government working well. The Supreme Court, a case coming to the Supreme Court and them recognizing agency overreach that we've gotten accustomed to is not constitutional. So they overturned the Chevron defense. And I remember when that happened, like people, big government people were just up in arms, like, oh my gosh, there's no way we could take away these power from these experts at these agencies. That's just, we're just going to fall apart. And again, it's ridiculous. If Congress does its job, which is what constitutionally they were supposed to do all along, is vote on all these regulations, using experts to inform these bills and legislation. So now Lee doing a great job, kind of recodifying it. And I'm assuming that legislation hasn't passed yet. Is it still draft?
No. Let me see if I can get the dates on this. It's been a while, I think. So, yeah. The idea dates back over a decade. Versions of the REINS Act were first introduced in 2010 and 2011. Introduced in 2013, 15, 17, 21, and 23, and most recently in the 118th and 119th Congresses. Recent proposal, the latest iteration, was introduced in the House of Representatives January 3rd, 2025. So the idea is still out there, and they're working to get it pushed through, but they've been working on it now for 16 years.
Well, and again, that Chevron defense overturning to happen in 2024. So now they better pass something because it's back in their lap to do something with it. So,
and they're never going to have a better chance because I would venture, I'm speaking a little bit out of turn, but I would venture to guess that this is probably something the Republicans are very much in favor of. Democrats, maybe not so much. And if that's the case, if this is kind of a partisan, if the vote on this thing does go down partisan lines, they're never going to have a better chance than right now to pass it.
Yep. So,
which is another frustration for people because they feel like even when opportunity presents, we don't take advantage of it.
Yeah.
And that's frustrating.
Yeah, it is hard. Like right now, Congress right now, I don't want to make excuses, but the the majority is so slim, it's hard to push through anything or really kind of push a vision or an agenda when you're this slim of a majority. Um, these elections coming up, super important.
Yeah.
So the last one we quoted, I think, was 48, and then Federalist 51. In this vein, it's probably the most quoted of the group of the papers, explaining the checks and balances as the practical means to limit power across the branches, including ensuring the executive has defensive tools but remains checked. So Madison wrote Federalist number 51. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. This iconic phrase captures Madison's core idea that self-interest and institutional ambition create mutual restraint, which limits the executive or any overreach from any branch. And also, he said, quote, in order to lay a due foundation for that separate and distinct exercise of the different powers of government, it is evident that each department should have a will of its own and consequently should be so constituted that the members of each should have as little agency as possible in the appointment of the members of the others. Were the executive magistrate or the judges not independent of the legislature in this particular, their independence in every other would be merely nominal. This directly addresses the limiting dependence, for example, on legislative control over salaries or appointments to preserve executive independence while preventing dominance. And then I got one more here from 51. This is a great line here, again from Madison. Quote, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself, unquote. So that's not exclusively about the executive, but it reinforces the need for structural limits on all power, including the executive.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite lines from Madison. If men were angels, but they are clearly not. And that is why ambition has to be made to counter ambition. And the idea that no one branch of government has an inordinate amount of leverage over the other, determining their salaries and things like that. That it needs to be that way. But I think that there's pros and cons to that arrangement, right? Because if the other branches don't have control over a salary, for example, that means the branch itself has control of its own salary. And I don't know how many times I personally have complained, and I've heard other people complain, like, how does Congress get to vote itself its own raise? You know? And of course,
Yep.
There are in most instances protections. You pass that, but it's not your Congress that's going to get that raise. It's the next one. So if you want to benefit from it, you have to be reelected, which it appears that 95% of them will be. So it's a pretty safe bet on their part. But the Supreme Court is another example. They didn't want judges to the Supreme Court to be elected because they didn't want them being swayed by the caprices of the masses, so to speak. So those have to be appointed. But then that gives one branch power to appoint an entire makeup of another branch of the judiciary. And so they balanced that by being appointed by the president and or being nominated by the president and approved by the Senate. And so both of the other two branches get a say in who sits on that bench in the third branch. So again, they had some brilliant compromises here. And in Madison agreed that the Constitution creates a government that is a hybrid of both national and federal characteristics. And we'll try to get to that in a minute about what that means and why it's important in his view. But that uh, he first defines it as a republic, and a government that derives its powers from the people and is administered by, and this is the key thing, administered by officials holding office for a limited time or during good behavior. And I really wish they would have expounded a little bit on what they mean by good behavior, because, man, it's difficult to look around now and find a politician who's behaving well. Which also, by the way,
Yep.
not part of this discussion, but when people think of the Supreme Court and they say they serve for life, that's not actually true. The wording of the Constitution, they serve at good behavior. So they can be removed for bad behavior.
Interesting. Right. Yeah, and I wanted to point out one thing as I read that a couple of those quotes from 51. You know, we say this in different ways over several episodes, but it really highlights the whole thing about, he's talking about basically, the ambitious nature of man, and why, which is why neither branch of government can have too much power, because he's acknowledging the ambitious, selfish nature of man, and that's what has to be checked. And that right there is the brilliance of the founding fathers, because all of them understood that man is sinful by nature, is ambitious, is selfish, and that's the starting point. And that's, obviously heavily influenced by the Bible and what the Bible teaches about the sin nature of man, starting off from a point of reality, rather than the Marxist view starts off from a point of utopia and says that
Good point.
if we're not living up to some utopian idea of how society should be, then that therefore we must force, by government force, ironically, society into that utopian vision, which of course leads to destruction every time, because the foundational perspective is at the wrong end. The founders were wise and brilliant to understand that you have to start with the sin nature of man, which is defined clearly in the Bible, and then craft a government acknowledging that, and of course, and bringing in religion to help refine, human nature to be, selfless at the individual level and the societal level and the family level and all that. But understanding that we'll never be a utopia. Man will never be perfect. Therefore, government must be structured to counteract those failings of man, which again is the selfish ambition and all that. So that's what's not talked about in society today much at all. Like there tends to be this, oh, why aren't we a utopia? Why aren't we a utopian society? And let's force society into that idea. And again, people's idea of what a utopia is changes across the board, which leads to just the confusion that we have in society today. So I just want to point that out. It's not said enough.
Yeah, that's good. The whole idea that men aren't angels, which is why government is necessary. And as you said, the founders were brilliant in a lot of ways. They understood human nature. They acknowledged it. They didn't try to pretend that humans were anything more or less than what they are. George Washington once complained about, in a private letter, because he wasn't prone to public complaining, but in a private letter he complained about the makeup of his own army, that they were kind of greedy. They bickered a lot, and he kind of lamented the fact that he was ever placed in charge of it. And he intimated in that letter, he said that we have to take men as they are, since we can't have them as we would wish. And I think that's true of armies, that's true of governments, that's true of countries. And so they recognized human nature. They used it to maximum. They tried to turn it to an advantage, but at the same time, they realized that there was no form of government that they could build. There was no document that they could write that would fully contain or curb human nature, which is why John Quincy Adams, as we talked about a couple of episodes ago, said that it was necessary, that religion is also necessary because a government of the heart is the only thing that can preserve a nation so conceived. It's that government of the heart. Strayed a little bit away from what we were talking about, but it's good. In Federalist number 10, James Madison, this is one of his more famous articles, where he talks about the existence of factions. And we mentioned this an episode or two ago. Oh, it was when we were talking about toxic empathy. How a lot of factions are built around toxic empathy. And intersectionality being the most recent fad, if you will, where factions are concerned. And if you look at that that diagram from a couple of episodes ago that we threw up by Kimberly Crenshaw, I think there's 12 or I don't know. There's a dozen or more groups that she has siphoned off and sectored out to show. I mean, and she's basically creating individual factions within society of people who have griefs and things to complain or be upset about. And while we may look at that and be a little bit, annoyed that people are being so factional, James Madison didn't waste any time complaining about the fact that factions exist. He accepted it as an ever-present reality, and he defined a faction again as a group of citizens, whether a majority or minority, who are united by a common interest or passion, or in some cases, a complaint or a grief. And in this group, their interests, their passions, their grief, complaint, whatever, possibly is adverse to the rights of other citizens or the community as a whole. And he argued that factions are inevitable. So, like I said, he didn't waste any time complaining about it. He just accepted it as a fact of life. He said that factions are inevitable because their causes are sown into the nature of man, stemming from different opinions, and most significantly, in Madison's view, the unequal distribution of property, which is really astute, because that's still really, if you peel it all the way back, that's still the complaint. The haves and the have-nots. You can read Kimberly Crenshaw's stuff on critical race theory. You can read Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, and it all comes down to what Madison was talking about. There are factions that splinter off in society, and a lot of times it is traced back to what they view as an unequal distribution of property. Those billionaires, or the people who have everything, the technocrats or whatever, and they're not paying their fair share. Stolen land. All of these are the fodder for factions. And Madison then contended that a pure democracy can't control factions, because at any time when one of those groups becomes majority, they easily just impose their will on everyone else. And by contrast, he said, a large republic with a greater number of citizens and a wider variety of interests makes it more difficult for any single faction to gain a majority and oppress the others. And he argued that elected representatives in a large republic, as opposed to literally every individual in the country taking part in every decision, which is what a true and pure democracy would be, Madison argued that in a large republic, the chosen representatives, are more likely to be individuals of wisdom and patriotism who will look out for the public good. Again, I think if Madison were resurrected and could look around today, he might have a different opinion of the representatives, their individual wisdom and their patriotism and their desire for the public good. But we've said it multiple times on this podcast. You've heard us refer to it, that America is not a democracy. And people will quibble over that. They will say, well, you're just splitting hairs. It's a representative democracy, or it's, or you'll insist, no, this is not a democracy. It's a republic, and it's not even a democratic republic. It's a constitutional republic with democratically elected representatives. And then they start to accuse you of semantics and, oh, you're just splitting hairs and blah, 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 blah. No, it really does matter. It mattered enough where these men spent a lot of time, a lot of words explaining the difference between a democracy and a republic and why it mattered. And this being one of them. Sorry, I won't go off on a diatribe about democracies and republics, but there's a reason why our Pledge of Allegiance, which has fallen out of favor as well in recent years, I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands, not the democracy. Yeah. But in Federalist number 10, Madison acknowledges these factions that are a natural result of liberty. He says you can't have liberty without there being the byproduct of factions. He actually said liberty is to faction what air is to fire, and an ailment without which it instantly expires. So he recognizes factions aren't good, but it's a necessary, well, it's an unavoidable byproduct of liberty in his view. He argues that the origins of these factions are part of human nature, as we said before, stemming from different opinions, passions, and most enduringly, this unequal distribution of property. He says the latent causes of faction are thus sown into the nature of man. It's unavoidable. People are going to have differing opinions. They're going to be in different states of life, different financial situations, etc. What's that?
Yeah, I just want to point out, and you mentioned this, but the whole idea of intersectionality exploits that reality. And we, as you said, we talked about it was episode 28, our episode titled "The Dark Side of Empathy," talking about toxic empathy, and we really pulled the thread on intersectionality and how kind of the Marxist, neo-Marxist view exploits that very concept. So again, the founding fathers were way ahead of these ideas, and that's why it's so important to understand where they're coming from and why they said these things, because they already saw the concerns of it way before even the word Marxism was a thing. That didn't come about until later on. But the idea of the latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man. Yes, they are, and they're being exploited by concepts like intersectionality.
Yeah. And his concern that, if any one faction gets too much power in a pure democracy, it just then is able to force its will on the rest of the country. And that was that highlighted the problem of factions in government, which I think in this instance, Madison and Hamilton would both agree that that sort of governance is dangerous. When people with specific interests become the decision makers, they are unlikely to be impartial. And that's why Madison wrote in Federalist number 10, no man is allowed to be a judge in his own cause, because his interest would certainly bias his judgment and, not improbably, corrupt his integrity. So with that being the case, is it a fair statement to say that lobbyists are essentially factions who are trying to gain a majority opinion in Congress? Is lobbying of an end run around this prevention of factions? Good.
Yeah, I would say, they are factions for sure. And I'm not trying to debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Because we all want to be able to lobby our representatives and lobby Congress. And, if we have a cause that we get enough support on, and like, hey, we need to, group together as a faction and go lobby Congress because we believe passionately about something, that's part of free speech and that's important. I think it's called K Street in the vernacular of the DC politics. K Street's filled with these lobbyists. Uh, and I think, kind of thinking about this on the fly here, the only real danger with that in my mind is that when that lobbying is done behind closed doors and the general public is not aware of the lobbying happening behind closed doors with Congress, that's where it kind of gets dangerous. As long as people can see, who's lobbying and what they're lobbying for, fine. Because then it allows um, the people to like, no, we disagree with that, or another faction to kind of counter that this faction, making this case. Again, back to the free speech part of it. But when it's kind of done behind closed doors, it negates the importance and the power of free speech. Again, just thinking on the fly here, but I don't know a good way to rein that in. Other than I will say this: you mentioned, um, forget how you said it, something to the effect of, it might have been just that Madison wanted to rein in, even the legislative branch from getting too powerful. Um, and this is controversial, but if there were term limits amongst Congress members, that would limit the power of these lobbyists as well, because a lot of these it was when you said that um, Congress Congress members are reelected like 94% of the time, incumbents, and a lot of that it makes the power of lobbyists almost too influential because they can kind of get in the pockets of these Congress members and kind of help them get reelected and kind of crowd out any competition, and that's dangerous. And I'm not saying term limits is the right answer, but it's something to be talked about to kind of again um, take away that kingdom building power that a Congress member has. And you can't argue that people that have been in Congress for decades, like Pelosi and Mitch McConnell and all these folks, you can't argue that they haven't gotten too powerful, over time, and it becomes really difficult to get them out.
Yeah. No, I don't think lobbying is necessarily a bad thing. I think there's probably too much money, campaign
Yeah.
finance issues associated with it, but no problem at all with a group trying to make their case to Congress, which is a different issue than trying to bribe them with millions and millions of campaign contributions. Um, no, lobbying is not necessarily a bad thing. As a matter of fact, if all goes well, we're going to have a lobbyist join us as a guest within the next few weeks. As an aside, we've got a really interesting topic coming up. I think is very interesting, where we're going to have a number of guests join us over a period of a couple of weeks to dive into a pretty interesting topic. So hopefully folks will stay tuned. But as far as lobbying is concerned, that is a faction. And it's one of those things that Madison recognized is inevitable. It's not only is it impossible, it wouldn't even be in the interest of liberty to try to quash factions. He said that if you tried to get rid of factions, the only way you could do it would be at the expense of liberty, which in his view, he said the cure is worse than the disease at that point. And so Madison's solution was not to eliminate factions, but to control their effects through a large representative republic where a multiplicity of interests prevents any single faction from becoming dominant. In his words, he said, in the extent and proper structure of the Union, therefore, we behold a Republican remedy for the disease most incident to the Republican government. He said, since the causes of factions cannot be removed without destroying liberty, a remedy that is worse than the disease, the focus must be on controlling their effects, which in his view is done through a large representative republic with a variety of interests. So that's kind of the down and dirty on Federalist number 10. Federalist number 14 is where he really goes into greater detail on the differences between a democracy and a republic. So this is one of the ones I like to read and to reference when having these discussions and debates with people who claim that we are a democracy or claim that there's no real meaningful difference between a democracy and a republic, the way that we implement it in the United States. But Madison would disagree. In this particular article in Federalist number 14, Madison addresses the anti-federalist argument that the United States is too large to be governed as a single republic. He counters that by distinguishing between a democracy and a republic. A democracy, he explains, requires citizens to assemble and govern in person, which limits it to a very small geographic area. Whereas a republic, on the other hand, is governed by elected representatives, which allow it to extend over a much larger territory. He also points out that the federal government's powers are limited to certain enumerated objects that concern all of the states, but that the states retain authority over all local matters. In clarifying this crucial difference between a direct democracy and a republic, Madison said it is that in a democracy the people meet and exercise the government in person. In a republic, they assemble and administer it by their representative agents. And in refuting the anti-federalist argument that our territory is too large for that, he says a democracy consequently has to be confined to a small spot. A republic may extend over a large region. Were you getting ready to say something?
Nope. I'm tracking.
And then, and this will be important later when we get to it, one of the next papers, Madison recaps the benefits of a strong union, implying that the advantages would be lost if the country were split into smaller confederacies. He said that we have seen the necessity of the Union as our bulwark against foreign danger, as the conservator of peace among ourselves, as the guardian of our commerce and other common interests. So while Madison was adamant about the federal nature of the government, meaning that the states retain a lot of power, as a matter of fact, they retain all of the power except for what's specifically enumerated to the federal government in the Constitution. While Madison was a huge proponent of the power of states and states' rights, he was equally adamant about the necessity of preserving the Union and not allowing it to be splintered into smaller confederacies. That will become important, as I said at the outset, when we get into the 1850s and the 1860s leading up to the Civil War. A lot of people were leaning heavily on their understanding of what Madison had written, putting a lot of emphasis on his support for states' rights, but kind of ignoring his emphasis on the necessity of preserving the Union. In Federalist number 39,
Which really quick is ironic a little bit, because of course the Declaration of Independence says that if the government is not living up to its obligations, then the people have the right to dissolve it and create a new government. Not specifically saying into different factions, but it does open the door for that, and it's the ultimate accountability to the government. But yeah, there's also a fear if the United States splinters into different factions and different governments, which is what was attempted. Well, which is what happened actually just before the Civil War. That's what, obviously, like you just said, Madison was afraid of, and of course what Abraham Lincoln fought vociferously to bring the country back together and to prevent from happening again.
yeah, and there were other things that Madison wrote too, that we'll talk about here in just a second, that kind of contributed, at least in the minds of the Confederacy, to the legitimacy of their cause. We'll get to that hopefully in a little bit if we have time. But Federalist number 39 Madison goes on to define the Republican form of government and argues that the Constitution creates a government that is both a hybrid of national and federal characteristics. So in addition to a lot of people's confusion between the difference between a democracy and a republic, I think there's also not a very firm understanding of the difference between a national and federal form of government. And Madison, in Federalist number 39, tried to explain that. When he says that the Constitution builds a government that is a hybrid of national and federal characteristics, his argument is that the proposed Constitution adheres to Republican principles, but it balances its effect directly on the people, which would be a national form of government, and its effect on the states, which would be a federal form of government. And that flows both ways, right? The influence of the people as a whole directly on their government, that would be a national form of government, affecting the national government through the states would be a federal form of government. And so in Madison's view, the Constitution masterfully, I think, balanced both of those things, allowing power from both angles. The way that was supposed to happen, though, is that elections is an example. The source of power for the federal government was supposed to partly come from the states, which was originally through the Senate, and partly a national character, meaning direct representation by a popular vote of the people, which would be the House of Representatives. And that was the way it was originally set up in the Constitution. But then something happened in 1913 that completely undermined and wiped out, maybe not completely, but it certainly eroded that arrangement. And that, of course, was the passing of the 17th Amendment. So what I just described, where the Senate originally was representing the states, that comes out of Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution, which originally said that the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislators or the legislature thereof, meaning that the body of the Senate had 2 senators from each state, and those senators were chosen by the state legislatures, not the people of the individual states. The House of Representatives, those representatives, the number of which was based on the census, were chosen directly by the people, and the senators were chosen by the state legislatures, which then provided representation for the people in the House and representation for the state in the Senate. But then the 17th Amendment comes along in 1913 and says that the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote, essentially taking the power to choose senators away from the state legislatures and putting it directly into the hands of the people, which essentially makes the House and the Senate, they're chosen in the same way. The Senate is a smaller version of the House. That's it, because they're chosen by the same people. And it removes that federal characteristic of the source of power that the Constitution and Madison were describing here. So kind of to recap that, the House of Representatives, the national branch, if you will, members are directly elected by the people in districts. And if it therefore represents the people as a unified nation, its power is national because it derives its power from the citizens directly. The Senate, which was supposed to be the federal branch, senators were originally chosen by the state legislatures. The Senate therefore represented the states as sovereign political entities. Its power was federal because it derived it from the state governments, ensuring that they had a direct institutional voice and a check on federal power. And that structure was crucial to safeguard federalism as the founders originally intended it. A law could not pass without the consent of both the people via the House and the states via the Senate. And this forced the national government to always consider the interests and sovereignty of the state governments. The 17th Amendment changed all that. The 17th Amendment mandated that U.S. senators be chosen by popular vote directly by the people of their respective states. It completely severed the institutional link between the state governments and the U.S. Senate, which undoes the original constitutional structure, right? Shifts the representation. Senators no longer represent the state government. They now represent the people of the state, just like the House of Representatives does. And that sounds like a subtle difference, but it's monumental. They are now accountable to the same popular electorate as the House and the governor, not to the legislative body that was supposed to protect the state's institutional interests. It weakened the federal check by removing the state legislators' power to appoint and recall senators. The amendment removed the state's most powerful check on federal authority. Senators are now more responsive to the national political trends, media pressure, and fundraising than to the specific institutional needs of their state governments. And lastly, it nationalized the Senate. The Senate effectively became a super House of Representatives. It still has unique powers and longer terms, but its members are chosen through the same national principle of popular election. And Madison's vision was one house for the people and one house for the states, and the 17th Amendment erased that vision.
That's the first kind of clear articulation of that argument that I've heard during doing the research with this. And I'm glad you tease that out because there is, in our circle we've heard talk of trying to maybe go back to Madison's original intent with this by a new amendment or whatever. And I still struggle with that. It's hard to envision. Again, he makes a good point, and his arguments are clear there. And I think that one of the points you just brought up was that it would insulate the Senate from, again, those factions and those and the lobbyists as much. It kind of makes them operate. It does make them operate from a different perspective and a different level of accountability. And I just don't know, because we haven't lived it and seen it in our lives, obviously, if the end result is good or bad there, like which version is better. But it'd be worth, I'd be supportive of trying to go back to how that was, because of just how things have been going in the United States over the last several decades. Like I said, the legislatures in both the House and the Senate abdicating a lot of their responsibilities to the other branches of the government. So anyway, it's a very interesting argument, and I would love to go back and kind of research the arguments leading up to the 17th Amendment as to why they decided to change the structure of the Senate and how they got elected.
Yeah, that would be an interesting study. And as we're talking about it, with that original arrangement for the Senate, now I'm interested in any connections there might be between their thought process for that and their arrangement that's laid out in Article 5 for amendments to the Constitution. Whereas, most people are familiar with the fact that whenever 2/3 of both houses deem it necessary, they can propose amendments to the Constitution. The part of Article 5 that most people aren't familiar with, though, is that there is a second way to amend the Constitution, and that is on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states. So there's a whole movement, actually, that's built around this Article 5 convention, where the states, if enough states get together, they can amend the Constitution, and they don't even need Congress to be a part of it. Of course, Congress doesn't like people to know about that. I think there's actually some some active work on their part trying to make sure that that doesn't happen. But if half of the bicameral legislature were already kind of at the behest of the states, it would seem even less likely that an Article 5 convention of states would ever be necessary, because those states are already represented in the Senate if they're elected if those senators are chosen by state legislatures. It seems more likely that an Article 5 convention of states would be viewed as necessary by the states now that they've lost the only representation they originally had, thanks to the 17th Amendment.
Yep.
I don't know.
Yep. Yeah, it's an interesting argument, and we'll see where that goes. And again, we're so divided right now; it's hard to get any momentum to change fundamentally how our government's structured. There's the movement for the Convention of States has gotten some momentum, but it's not quite reached where it needs to get to get to the point of actually looking at these things tangibly for leading to tangible changes. But it's worth looking at probably because we're so divided, and because factions are so influential today. And maybe these changes that we're talking about would lead to more unity and less disruption into our government.
Yeah. I would be willing to try it as well. And I also think the original arrangement just makes sense to me. I mean, if your senators are elected in the same way as the House of Representatives, what's the point of having two different houses or two different chambers?
Yeah. Yeah.
Other than the fact that your representation is slightly different in each one. One is based on your population, and one is just two per state.
Right. Which is a distinct difference, and it does change how they operate.
And longer terms.
But it also is interesting. Yeah, the terms are different. And that's a good point. Like at the Senate level, they kind of operate at large, so to speak. Whereas in the House, they have specific districts that they represent. Yeah, it's a good point. I lost my thought there. I was going to say that it does seem a little bit too similar, because it seems like it's rare when one party controls the House and the other party controls the Senate. It does happen, but it's rare. And maybe that's a sign that they're too similar. In this, you know what I mean? Like if it was more often that different parties controlled each chamber, then that would show that they're different enough and counteracting enough. But the fact that they tend to be both go in one direction or the other, kind of like to your point, kind of makes them almost too similar.
Yeah. I think there's a deeper hole we could dig there for sure. Maybe we will in the future.
Yeah.
17th Amendment is something that kind of hangs out in the back of my mind.
Yeah. And maybe we can do one on the Convention of States combined with the argument of the 17th Amendment as kind of two different but related topics.
Federalist 41 and Federalist 45, they kind of have a common thread that runs through them. I mentioned earlier that Madison was all about states' rights and power to the states, but he was also equally adamant about preserving the Union. He went to lengths to emphasize the dangers of a weak and disunited government, framing the new powers in the Constitution as essential for preserving the nation. He said the consequences of disunion cannot be too highly colored, or too often exhibited. Every man who loves peace, every man who loves his country, every man who loves liberty ought to have it ever before his eyes, he said. And he justifies the federal government's powers related to national defense as a fundamental and essential function of any government. He said security against foreign danger is one of the primitive objects of a civil society, and he viewed a united government as essential to being able to secure the country against foreign danger. And then he uses a question, rhetorical question, to argue for the necessity of a standing army, which, of course, the colonists, people of his era, would have been very leery and wary of that idea. But Madison asks, how could a readiness for war in time of peace be safely prohibited unless we could prohibit in like manner the preparations and establishments of every hostile nation? Meaning, unless you can guarantee that no one is preparing for war against you during a time of peace, you should probably be preparing for a war. And that's consistent with a lot of what the other founders wrote as well. But the idea of a standing army would have been a little bit off-putting, no doubt, to his audience.
Yeah.
But those two things, the need for a standing army, the need for a united government, but then as he advocates also in other articles for essentially the Second Amendment, the need for citizens to remain armed against tyranny specifically, those three things combined provided the justification in many minds in the 1850s and 60s for secession. It was the justification that the Confederacy leaned heavily on. In Federalist 45, Madison addresses the fear that the federal government will overpower the state governments, arguing that the states will retain significant power and influence. And essentially that was the complaint of the southern states, was that the federal government was becoming too powerful. It was trying to overpower the states and reducing their autonomy and their own influence within their own states. Madison directly addresses the fear that the federal government will become too powerful and encroach on the authority of the state governments. He famously argued that the powers delegated to the federal government are few and defined, while those remaining in the states are numerous and indefinite. He explained that the federal government's power would be primarily exercised on external objects such as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, and the states, in contrast, would retain authority over all objects that concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people. And, as we've talked about before, in the South in the 1850s and 60s, what was considered property, their definition of property was different than what we view it now. Rightly so. Our view is different. They viewed slaves as property, and therefore squarely within the state's purview to decide how that was addressed. Madison also suggested that the federal government's influence would be most prominent in times of war and danger, while the state governments would be more influential in times of peace and security. Madison said that the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and definite. Probably one of the most famous quotes from the Federalist Papers. It states that the federal government's powers are limited and enumerated. The states have broad authority. The understanding of the Constitution since Madison's time has definitely changed. Seems like a lot of politicians nowadays, administrations, they look to the Constitution to say, if it doesn't say I can't do it, then I can, which is 180 degrees out of the original intent. You can only do what is specifically enumerated in the Constitution as the federal government. We need to get back to that. I often say that conservatives, true conservatives, are not opposed to a big government, but they do insist that it be limited. With a nation the size as ours, stretching from coast to coast, with 330 plus million people, you have no hope of a small government. but it should be limited. And that's what the Constitution does. It limits the government, regardless of its size. That's what it's supposed to do. Madison also specified distinct spheres of influence for the federal and state governments. Federal government deals with national issues, state handles the local matters. He said the former will be principally on external objects, talking about the federal government. War, peace, negotiation, foreign commerce. Powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people. Do you have something?
Got something to add here. Yeah. So I want to back up really quick here to, you mentioned what he said in Federalist 45, the powers delegated to the proposed constitution to the federal government are few and defined, which remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. And we talked about his fear. You talked about his fear of federal government overpowering the states. And of course, these were written before the Constitution was ratified. These Federalist Papers were written in order to argue for certain principles that would end up in the Constitution. And this is an interesting one because in the Constitution, we talk about the 10th Amendment a lot. So the Bill of Rights, the last amendment in the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment, which gave powers to the state that were not explicitly, it assumed powers to the state rather than the federal government that were not explicitly given to the federal government in the Constitution, which implies, heavy states' rights. Ironically, or I guess however, in the Constitution before the Bill of Rights, in the main Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, it grants Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So that's referred to as the Commerce Clause. And the Commerce Clause over time has been interpreted differently again over time, under the guise of the living Constitution, I guess, mindset. It has led to, despite the 10th Amendment, designed to ensure the states have their rights and freedoms from federal government overreach, the Commerce Clause has led to the encroachment of that. So again, I'll just read here. Let's see. The early narrow interpretation, the 19th century, of the Commerce Clause, in Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824, Chief Justice John Marshall defined commerce broadly as commercial intercourse but limited federal power to truly interstate activities. This respected state powers for interstate matters, aligning with the 10th Amendment. And then during the New Deal era, the 1930s to the 1970s, the court shifted dramatically. And we've talked about in several now episodes of this podcast, especially after like World War II, or during World War II and after, a lot of Supreme Court justices nominated by several kind of left-leaning presidents have led to a dramatic change in how the Supreme Court has viewed the Constitution. So the court shifted dramatically to uphold federal regulations under President Roosevelt's programs. In NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel Corporation in 1937, it allowed regulation of labor practices in manufacturing because they affected interstate commerce. And the pinnacle was Wickard versus Filburn in 1942, where a farmer growing wheat for personal use was regulated. And I remember this one now. This one's crazy. A farmer growing wheat in his own farm was regulated because it indirectly impacted national wheat markets. This aggregation principle, where small local activities add up to substantial effects, vastly expanded federal reach into areas like agriculture, manufacturing, and civil rights. Critics, including states' rights advocates, saw this as overriding the 10th Amendment by letting Congress regulate almost anything with an economic nexus, diminishing reserved state powers over local matters like education, crime, or zoning. And again, I could go on. I'll stop there, but that's a whole other episode in itself. But it's just interesting how these arguments over time started with the arguments made by Madison, Hamilton, other founding fathers. They were trying to prevent and balance these very complicated situations because the Commerce Clause was in the Constitution for a reason to make sense. But if you interpret it incorrectly or with a bias or an agenda, it can be twisted and used to undermine or get push out of balance what the founders were desperately trying to get into balance. And I think this is an example of that.
I think you're right. Yeah, that particular court case is maddening.
Yeah. And of course, the Supreme Court, they reference prior cases and they've expanded that look for decades since. Again, up until the current Supreme Court kind of starting to peel away some of those overreaches.
Yeah. It's fascinating to see how we've devolved maybe, depending on your view. But yeah, Madison, he goes on in Federalist 46 to talk about how, in his view, he predicts that the representatives in the national legislature would be more focused on their local constituencies than the state legislators would be on the national concerns. And so to what you were just describing there with that particular court case, what year was that? It was in the 40s, wasn't it?
1942, yeah.
Yeah. So 17th Amendment was passed before that. And so this poor farmer, who does he turn to for this? His representatives in Congress, are they more interested in local issues or national issues? Seems like national.
Point. Yeah.
It's more of a national, an embrace of the national view with the Commerce Clause being invoked, right? Which is sacrificing a local issue for a national one, allegedly. So maybe that's, I don't know, I'd have to think about that a little bit more, but maybe that's an example of one of the first breakdowns in that federal and nationalist structure that occurred just, 3.5, 4 years after the 17th Amendment was implemented. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
In Federalist 46, though, Madison points out that an armed populace is a key check on the power of federal government. He says, besides the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation, he sees this as an important check on government overreach. So when people want to argue that the Second Amendment is somehow about hunting or even personal self-defense of your home, those are both really great byproducts of the Second Amendment. That is not what it was intended for. When it talks about a well-regulated militia, again, if you read these other documents by the founding fathers, Federalist Papers being one of them, Federalist number 46, it's very clear what their intent was. And as Madison points out here, an armed populace, which in his view apparently is synonymous with a well-armed militia. He wasn't talking about a national guard. It was an armed population, was a key check on the power of the federal government. He contrasted the American situation with that of the European nations, where the governments are afraid of having their own citizens armed. He said, notwithstanding the military establishments in several kingdoms of Europe, the governments are afraid to trust the people with arms. And so, right now here in Virginia, the Second Amendment issue is front and center because the new administration under Abigail Spanberger, the current General Assembly, they are working overtime to implement new gun control laws that take away your Second Amendment rights in all but name only. You have the right, but it is so difficult to exercise that right within the boundaries of the laws that they are trying to pass that you essentially don't have it. And it starts to feel a lot like what Madison was describing here in Europe, where the government is afraid to allow its own people to be armed. And what's that old saying? If the government, any government that starts to indicate that they want to take away your weapons is probably a government that intends to do something soon that you would shoot them for.
Yeah.
So this idea that Madison had that a combination of state governments and an armed citizenry could resist any overreach by the federal government, even in a hypothetical military conflict. Madison said state governments with the people on their side would be able to repeal the danger. So a strong state government with a lot of power and authority, armed citizenry, those two things combined, Madison said, would allow the people and the states to prevent the federal government from becoming too powerful if it started to overreach, even in a hypothetical military conflict. And in the 1860s, that hypothetical became a reality. So during the political crisis preceding the Civil War, I have to believe that Federalist number 45 and number 46 became central to the Confederacy's legal justification for what they wanted to do. It's why for them, many of them, I think, if you look at them objectively and discount everything you've been told from high school history classes, all the reasons why you should hate them and why they were terrible people, if you just look at them and look at their arguments, you can. And I'm not saying there weren't crazy people. There are crazy people in every era. But I think many of these people were educated, well-reasoned, and reasonable people who were looking at what the Constitution says, in their understanding of it. And if you do that, you can start to see how the conflict was presented as a constitutional defense against states' rights, against federal overreach, with the unfortunate issue of slavery being the primary right that they sought to protect. The underlying principle, though, was this view that Madison had of maintaining strong state authority and autonomy with indefinite powers, with only enumerated powers granted to the federal government. Those who fiercely defended what they viewed as this underlying constitutional principle, even though they may have disagreed with the specific state right at the center of the debate, slavery, Confederate leaders heavily relied on Madison's argument for a limited federal authority, but took them to an extreme that Madison himself condemned. They claimed to be fulfilling his vision of states resisting a tyrannical central government, while simultaneously ignoring his life's work preserving the Union. Kind of an overview before we get into a couple of the details in the last few minutes that we have here, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I never really thought of it that way, that, 45 and 46 were, potential justifications for the South seceding and, leading to the Civil War. And I had thought about, of course, like I said, the Declaration of Independence, but yeah, it's a really good point. And and it's again, it's kind of a touchy subject because we do want, like, again, the co-hosts on this podcast generally want the states to have the freedom to be independent from the federal government, where it makes sense, where it's constitutionally protected to do so. Um, so that is still kind of a sticking point as to what that means in effect. I don't know if people know this, but there's talks in the modern today, in the last decade or so, of like portions of California seceding from the Union, and portions of Oregon and Colorado, where you have these states that are the blue and the red portions of the states are so distinctly different, either seceding from the United States or seceding from the state itself to create its own state. So there's actually movements out there that are openly, that exist right now, that are talking about that. So it's not a thing that just kind of died with the end of the Civil War. It's still an idea that's out there, and I think it's an idea that is important to keep, because there has to be the states have to have some recourse, that if the federal government goes too far in its overreach, is too much, that it will only happen if it's not adhering to the Constitution. And there's always a danger of that. And we've already seen that. Again, we've talked about the Commerce Clause. You can argue led to federal overreach of what the Constitution intended. We talked about the Chevron doctrine leading to overreach, using these agencies and giving them powers that the Constitution never gave them. So if those kind of things go too far, the states should still need to have some kind of recourse to be able to dramatically free itself from that overreach. So just an argument that has not gone away.
It makes me wonder what would have happened if this initial disagreement over states' rights had been centered on any other right other than slavery.
Right.
If the outcome would have been different. The major sticking point, though, even if the Confederates were completely right about everything that Madison wrote, they were still wrong in the fact that a lot of their argument hinged on the fact that they viewed a person as property.
Yeah. Lincoln's had the idea before the Civil War of the equal rights of man, and there's several writings where he said that. And when the South seceded, even though it was for those, to allow them to maintain the slave trade and all that, which is despicable reasons, Lincoln's argument that he brought up many, many times as to the justification for combating with arms, taking up arms to prevent that from happening or to bring the country back together, was because he believed in maintaining the Union of the United States. And that reason alone, to your point, is controversial, because, like you said, if there was another reason that the South or any state wanted to secede from the Union, whether it was just like an agriculture, or I don't know, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but something that was less nefarious as a motivation, I think, based on what Lincoln said at the time. So it kind of partly depends on, if Lincoln wasn't the president, then if it was a different president, would the Civil War have happened? To your point, we don't know. We'll never know. But it did seem like that Lincoln was, and he was obviously a very well read, brilliant guy, He knew the Federalist Papers, clearly knew the Declaration of Independence, cited the Declaration of Independence many, many times in his speeches and his thoughts as to the rationale for why the slaves should be free, because he looked at them as equal in the eyes of God. And at the same time, being aware of all those documents and these justifications in Federalist 45, Federalist 46, etc., believe that it was worth fighting to prevent the breakup of the Union, which again seems to be somewhat in contrast with the rationale that the South used in 45 and 46.
Yeah. And I think, you know, unfortunately, as we've talked about many times on this podcast, that from our founding, we hadn't lived up to that promissory note that Martin Luther King Jr. talked about, where we said that all men are created equal. And from the very outset, we treated some men differently than others. Apparently, they weren't all equal. Endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Immediately denying two of those three to a significant portion of the people living in America at the time of its founding.
Yep.
And justified in doing so in their minds, at least in the minds of at least two states in the South, which were the ones who, insisted that slavery remain, Georgia and South Carolina. Justified in those actions by redefining what a person is. And I think, as you were describing there, Lincoln, while he may have been opposed to slavery as a concept, at least in the beginning, he was more intent on keeping the Union together than abolishing slavery. I think he said at one point that if he could preserve the Union by keeping every slave in chains, he would do that. But if he could preserve the Union by freeing every slave, he would also do that. And so his main objective was to preserve the Union, at least at first. And in order to reconcile that issue, we ended up fighting a war that lasted over 4 years. Killed, depending on who and what you read, 650,000 plus people. If you count civilian casualties, that number climbs to over 1 million, I'm sure. And then required 2 constitutional amendments, the 13th and the 15th, to secure for the African American population their personhood and their rights as citizens. The reason I say all of that is that as I've said before on this podcast, and I'll say over and over again, I maintain that we have a similar issue now. The issue isn't slavery, though, it's abortion. And that institution only exists because we've redefined what a person is. Due to the Dobbs decision, it has been turned back over to the states to decide how they want to handle that. It's a state's right. And I think if we're ever to completely abolish that institution, which in my mind is every bit as despicable as slavery, hopefully it won't require a war, but it probably will require a constitutional amendment to secure the personhood and the rights for a group of people who, like the slaves, are faceless, they're voiceless, they're helpless, in a very vulnerable position through no choice of their own. So anyway, that was quite an excursion from what we were here to talk about.
It's related. And I want to point out our Substack that you have an article about this. It's dated, but it's still relevant. Find it here. So if you go to our Substack, which you can find in the description of this podcast and any podcast, whatever platform you're on, you can see a link to our Substack. Slavery, Abortion, and the Mega Republican Platform. This is back, you originally wrote it back in July of 2024. and we put it on our Substack a few months ago, where you make that case very eloquently that you just made just now. So go check that out.
Thanks for that shout out. That article was originally written in response to a change in the Republican Party's platform and its stance on abortion, heavily influenced by President Trump, which softened the Republican Party's platform stance on abortion to its detriment. I think the Republicans softened their position on a very important biblical and political issue for political expedience, in my mind. And I was sorry to see it. So I didn't have a lot of good things to say about the MAGA platform in that article, because I'm not partial to a party. I try to be principled, regardless of party. And anytime someone forces me to tell them what political party I'm affiliated with, I generally tell them that I'm a Christian first, a conservative second, and a Republican by process of elimination.
Yep. And I love that quote. It's perfect. Perfectly said.
But back to Madison and the Civil War. I think you've got to go soon, though, so we won't belabor this point.
Yeah.
But they justified their resistance and their secession, really anchored in Madison's writings regarding factions. They viewed the anti-slavery portion of the country as an anti-slavery faction that was trying to impose its will on the 11 states in the South who still had the institution of slavery. And they viewed their combination of 11 states and its people, their governments, with their armed citizenry. The very act of forming the Confederacy was seen as a fulfillment of Madison's idea that the several states were combining to resist what they perceived as federal tyranny. They had the people on their side, at least in those states. And while they might not have always footnoted Federalist number 46 in their speeches, their ideas, the ideas from Federalist 46 were certainly present. Madison, though, I think would have been very disappointed in that. His writings were to convince states to join the Union initially, to ratify the Constitution, not to give them a blueprint for leaving it. His arguments about state power were meant as assurance, not as an escape hatch. And he viewed secession as a fatal poison and a colossal heresy that would lead to anarchy. So supporters of the Confederacy had to either ignore Madison's later writings or argue that he had lost his way in his old age. So anyway, there's a lot more to unpack there, but that'll have to be for another day.
Yeah, maybe we can, the third episode is kind of, we can maybe close the loop on that one a little bit, because you have some really good research on that. And I also, just to kind of foreshadow the way kind of envisioning doing episode 3 is, again, kind of comparing and contrasting the two views of Madison and Hamilton, which encapsulate kind of the two general arguments of how the executive should be and the balance of powers in all the branches of our government. And I really want to bring in, again, we mentioned Montesquieu briefly today. We mentioned last episode John Locke and Hume. And I think I want to focus on that a little bit more, to kind of show where these ideas came from, kind of why Hamilton leaned a certain way in certain areas and Madison leaned a different way, and where they overlapped and why they overlapped, basing it on the intellectual thought leaders at the time that they were reading, such as Locke, Montesquieu, etc., to kind of help understand that these ideas that they had. Any person can have an idea that just kind of comes out of nowhere. It seems like it comes out of nowhere. We have an episode on where does thought come from, by the way. It's a really good episode. But those thoughts they actually do come from somewhere. They come from an understanding and what we're reading, what we know, what our life experiences. And so, of course, Hamilton and the Founding Fathers definitely were, their impetus to how they thought the government should be formed was heavily influenced by their life experiences, what was happening in Europe and had happened in Europe and in England in particular. But also they saw kind of what was going wrong there and how things were going off kilter, and the overreach of the monarch and the king in England. But they determined how to rectify that by looking at ancient sources of knowledge and wisdom and experience in, again, those modern thought leaders that I referenced. So we'll try to bring in those arguments and angles and try to find direct links to where they were referring to those thought leaders. And I shouldn't forget Blackstone, I think, right? Well, that was one of the influential pastors at the time. Is that his name, right? Very, very heavily influenced. And of course, the Bible. So we'll try to bring in some of those references as well as to justify the similarities and the contrasts between what Hamilton and Madison believed.
That'll be good. I think it's probably incumbent upon us to let everybody know that we're not attorneys. We're not constitutional scholars. We both spent the majority of our adult life defending the Constitution, though. And I think we both subscribe to the view of George Mifflin Dallas, the 11th Vice President of the United States, who said, "I hold that every American citizen has a right to form an opinion of the Constitution. The Constitution in its words is plain and intelligible and is meant for the homebred, unsophisticated understanding of our fellow citizens." I would put myself in that category, homebred and unsophisticated. I take it, therefore, Dallas said, it is not a presumption in the private citizen to form an opinion of the Constitution. So that's what we're doing here. It's just two homebred, unsophisticated dudes reading the Constitution, reading the Federalist Papers, and forming an opinion about it. And I hope other people will too. I hope if these episodes do anything, that it makes people curious and motivates them to go back to the original sources. Go read the Constitution, read the Bill of Rights, read the amendments, read the Federalist Papers. It can be a little bit challenging reading for sure at times. So if you're not up to that, find a digital copy of it, dump it into ChatGPT or Grok or whatever your AI of choice is, and ask it to translate it into modern day English. It'll do it. And it's actually pretty good. Again, I would highly recommend reading the original source in its original form, but if you can't do that, that's a good substitute. But I really do think, and to the article that Jim wrote, Exhuming Publius, the only way we're going to solve a lot of the issues in our country today is if people go back to the sources. Declaration of Independence, Constitution, Federalist Papers, the Bible, and we talk to each other about it. And as you hopefully as you could see from this episode, these are not dusty old ideas that no longer apply. The stuff they were talking about in 1788 still applies today. What is the appropriate nature of the executive? What is too much power? What are the dangers of a fractured and factioned legislative branch that outsources its power to regulatory agencies? The issue of states' rights, abortion, slavery, all of these things, they're not old and dusty topics. They're as alive and important today as they were in 1788.
Absolutely. Well said. I never heard that quote from that vice president before. That's perfect. And as fellow Marines, we take pride in being, what'd you say, unsophisticated and
homebred and unsophisticated.
Homebred and unsophisticated. Yeah, Marines say that with pride. So,
so I've enjoyed it, Jim.
Brother.
Thanks,
Me
man.
too.
It's always good.
As always. All right. God bless.
God bless.